June 17th was supposed to be a normal day for the WNBA. The league released its first All-Star voting returns. Fans checked the rankings, sports shows found a few quick talking points, and everyone was expected to move on. Instead, one number immediately changed the conversation. Caitlin Clark was fifth. Not first, not second, not even fourth. Fifth. In any other situation, a top 5 ranking would be considered a massive accomplishment. But Caitlin Clark is not just another player in the league. She is the athlete who has become the center of almost every major discussion surrounding women's basketball. She fills arenas, dominates television ratings, sells merchandise at historic levels, and generates more attention than anyone else in the sport. Whether people support her or criticize her, they watch. Whether they agree with the hype or push back against it, they engage. That level of influence is rare in any professional league, which is why seeing her name sitting in 5th place immediately raised eyebrows across the basketball world. The reaction was instant. Social media exploded with questions, debates, theories, and frustration. Fans weren't simply asking why Clark wasn't first, they were asking how it was even possible. How does the most talked-about player in the sport find herself behind 4 other names in an event that is supposed to reflect popularity? How does someone who continues to drive record-breaking interest end up looking up at the leaderboard instead of sitting at the top of it? The questions kept coming because the ranking didn't seem to match what people were seeing every day. The crowds were still showing up, the television audiences were still tuning in, the jerseys were still flying off the shelves. Everywhere fans looked, Clark remained the biggest attraction in the league. Yet when the votes were revealed, the picture looked completely different. What made the situation even more surprising was the comparison to last season. Just 1 year ago, Caitlin Clark wasn't fighting to stay near the top of the voting, she was dominating it. Her name led the returns comfortably, and the gap between her and many other players reflected the enormous wave of popularity she brought into the league. Fast forward 12 months, and suddenly the same player appeared several spots lower. To many observers, that didn't make sense. If anything, Clark's profile had grown. Her influence had expanded. Her games had become even bigger events. So how could a player who seemed more visible than ever suddenly appear less popular on paper? The more people examined the situation, the more they realized that this story might not actually be about popularity at all. That realization shifted attention away from Clark herself and towards something much larger. Fans started looking beyond the rankings and asking questions about the process that produced them. They began examining how All-Star voting actually works, who gets a say in the final results, and whether the public truly has the level of influence many people assumed it did. For years, most casual fans viewed All-Star voting as a simple popularity contest. If enough people voted for a player, that player would rise to the top. The concept seemed straightforward, but once Clark's 5th place ranking appeared, thousands of fans suddenly discovered that the reality was much more complicated. Behind every vote sits a system, behind every ranking sits a formula, and behind that formula are decisions made by league officials about whose opinions matter most. Now, it's important to be clear about something before going any further. There is no evidence that the voting is rigged. There is no credible reporting suggesting manipulation. There is no proof that anyone altered results or interfered with the process. But that's not what has many fans concerned. The debate isn't really about whether the vote was legitimate. The debate is about whether the system itself produces outcomes that match what fans expect. Because sometimes a result can feel controversial, even when every rule is followed perfectly. Sometimes the structure itself creates the controversy. And as people dug deeper into the mechanics of All-Star voting, they found themselves confronting a possibility that hadn't crossed their minds before. What if Caitlin Clark's drop wasn't a mistake? What if it wasn't an accident? What if the outcome was exactly what the system was designed to produce?
That question has become the center of one of the biggest conversations in women's basketball.
Because once you understand how the voting works, who shares control of the process, and why the league adopted its current format in the first place, Caitlin Clark's ranking starts to look very different. Suddenly, the story becomes less about one player sitting in fifth place and more about a league trying to balance popularity, competition, media influence, and public opinion all at the same time. And the deeper you look into that balancing act, the more fascinating the story becomes, because what appears at first glance to be a simple voting result may actually reveal something much bigger about the future of the WNBA, the role of its biggest star, and the people who ultimately decide whose voice carries the most weight. The moment the first All-Star voting returns were released, most people expected to see a familiar name sitting comfortably at the top. After all, this is Caitlin Clark we're talking about, the player whose arrival transformed the WNBA into one of the most discussed sports stories in America, the player whose games routinely draw audiences that many leagues would envy, the player whose highlights dominate social media feeds before the final buzzer has even sounded. For months, the conversation around Clark has centered on how much attention she brings to the league. That's why the initial rankings felt so jarring. Fans opened the results expecting confirmation of what they already believed. Instead, they found a surprise that instantly became one of the biggest stories in basketball. Clark wasn't first, she wasn't second, she wasn't third, she wasn't even fourth. Her name appeared in fifth place, behind multiple players who, while undeniably talented and accomplished, simply do not generate the same level of public attention. The ranking immediately created confusion because it seemed disconnected from the reality fans were witnessing every week. Everywhere Clark plays, there is evidence of her influence. Road arenas experience attendance spikes. Television networks prioritize her games. Merchandise sales continue to reflect her popularity. Opposing teams openly acknowledge the attention she brings whenever the Indiana Fever visit town. Yet when the first official All-Star voting checkpoint arrived, the standings told a completely different story. What made the reaction so intense wasn't just the ranking itself, it was the expectations surrounding it. For months, fans had been hearing about Clark's impact on the league. Analysts discussed ratings, team executives talked about attendance growth, broadcasters highlighted record-breaking audiences. Even people who disagreed about Clark's place among the league's best players generally agreed on one thing: nobody attracted more attention. So when the ranking suggested that 4 other players had earned higher positions, many supporters immediately felt something wasn't adding up. The disconnect between perception and outcome created a wave of questions that spread far beyond Indiana Fever fans. The names ahead of Clark only intensified the discussion. Leading the voting were some of the biggest stars in women's basketball, players with championship pedigrees, MVP awards, and years of established success. No reasonable observer would argue that they didn't deserve recognition, but the debate wasn't really about talent. It was about popularity. It was about influence. It was about whether the player who had become the face of countless league storylines could realistically sit behind so many others in a process that many people assumed reflected fan enthusiasm above all else. Every time someone looked at the rankings, the same question resurfaced. If Caitlin Clark is driving so much of the conversation around the league, how is she not driving the vote as well? Social media quickly became a battleground. Some fans argued that the rankings proved Clark's popularity had been exaggerated. Others pushed back, pointing to attendance numbers, television ratings, and merchandise sales as evidence that her influence remained unmatched. Meanwhile, countless posts appeared from confused supporters simply trying to understand how the voting system worked. The more people discussed the results, the clearer it became that this wasn't just another sports debate. It had become a discussion about perception, power, and the gap between public popularity and official recognition. Every new comment seemed to fuel another round of arguments, keeping the story alive long after the rankings were first released. Adding to the shock was the fact that this wasn't some final result delivered after weeks of voting had concluded. These were only the first returns. This was the league's initial snapshot of where things stood, yet it immediately dominated headlines. In many ways, that reaction revealed just how unusual the situation felt.
If Clark had landed second, the story disappears within hours. If she had landed third, there would be some discussion but little outrage. Fifth, however, crossed a psychological line. It transformed a routine voting update into a league-wide controversy and forced people to start asking questions they hadn't considered before.
And that is where the real story begins. Because once the initial shock faded, attention shifted away from the rankings themselves and towards something much more important. Fans stopped asking who was ahead of Caitlin Clark and started asking how they got there. They stopped focusing on the outcome and began examining the process. And the deeper they looked into that process, the more they discovered that the All-Star vote was not nearly as simple as most people believed. In fact, understanding why Clark landed in fifth requires understanding a system that operates very differently from what most fans imagine. And once that system comes into focus, the ranking that seemed impossible suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. If the ranking itself surprised people, the numbers behind it created even more confusion. Because the moment fans started comparing this year's voting returns to last year's, they discovered a gap that seemed almost impossible to explain at first glance. In the previous All-Star voting cycle, Caitlin Clark wasn't merely leading the field, she was dominating it. Her vote totals towered over much of the competition, reflecting the enormous wave of excitement that followed her transition from college basketball to the professional game. The numbers painted a clear picture of a player whose popularity had reached levels rarely seen in the history of women's basketball. Fast forward a year, and suddenly that picture looked completely different. The most shocking figure wasn't necessarily Clark's ranking, it was the dramatic decline in her raw vote total. Last season's first voting returns showed Clark receiving well over 500,000 votes. This year, the number was significantly lower. For many fans, that statistic immediately triggered another question. How could the most visible player in the league receive dramatically fewer votes at a time when her fame appears even larger than it was a year ago? Normally, a drop of that size would suggest declining interest, fading popularity, or reduced relevance. Yet none of those explanations seemed to fit what was happening around the league. If anything, Clark's profile appeared stronger than ever. That's where the story becomes difficult to reconcile. Everywhere fans looked, evidence suggested her influence remained enormous. Television ratings continued to spike whenever the fever appeared on national broadcasts. Opposing teams still treated Clark's visits as major events. Arena attendance remained one of the biggest talking points across the league. Her highlights continued to dominate sports coverage. Even people who rarely followed women's basketball knew who Caitlin Clark was. That level of visibility doesn't usually belong to an athlete losing public support. It belongs to an athlete expanding it, which made the voting numbers feel even more puzzling. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. On one hand, Clark remained the most discussed player in the sport. On the other hand, the voting totals suggested something entirely different. Fans were left staring at two realities that didn't seem capable of existing at the same time. The first reality was what they could see with their own eyes every week: packed arenas, massive television audiences, constant media coverage, endless social media engagement. The second reality was the voting data sitting in front of them: lower totals, lower rankings, less apparent support. Naturally, people started asking which version told the true story. Some observers pointed out that overall voter participation appeared lower across the league. That's a fair observation and an important piece of context. If fewer people are casting ballots overall, then many players will naturally see reduced totals compared to previous years. But even that explanation only answers part of the question. A decline in turnout can explain why raw numbers shrink. It does not automatically explain why positions change. If everyone loses votes at roughly the same rate, the hierarchy generally remains similar. The biggest stars usually stay near the top. Yet in Clark's case, the hierarchy shifted dramatically. That distinction is what kept the debate alive. What makes this even more fascinating is that Clark's popularity has become measurable in ways that extend far beyond All-Star voting. Broadcasters openly discuss the ratings impact of her games. League executives acknowledge the attendance boost associated with her appearances.
Merchandise rankings consistently place her among the most recognizable athletes in professional sports. These aren't subjective opinions, they're business indicators. They represent tangible evidence of public interest. That's why so many fans struggled to accept the idea that a player driving those kinds of numbers could suddenly find herself falling behind multiple competitors in a popularity-based event. The deeper people looked, the more they realized that traditional assumptions about voting might not apply here. Many fans instinctively viewed the rankings as a direct measurement of popularity. More support equals more votes equals a higher position. Simple. But the situation surrounding Clark suggested something more complicated was happening. The numbers weren't behaving the way many people expected them to. They weren't matching the broader indicators that usually accompany superstar status. And when numbers stop matching expectations, people start looking for explanations elsewhere.
That search for answers ultimately led fans away from the vote totals themselves and toward the structure behind them. Because perhaps the most important question wasn't why Caitlin Clark received fewer votes. The more important question was why those votes seemed to matter less than people thought. Once that possibility entered the conversation, the entire debate shifted direction. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on how many people supported Clark, it was on how much influence that support actually carried. And that's when attention turned toward a detail hidden beneath the headlines, one that would completely change how many fans viewed the All-Star voting process. As surprising as Caitlin Clark's fifth-place ranking was, there was another detail buried inside the voting results that immediately caught the attention of Indiana Fever fans. It wasn't simply that Clark had fallen behind several stars around the league, it was who one of those players happened to be. Sitting ahead of Clark in the early returns was her own teammate, Aliyah Boston. The moment fans noticed it, the conversation took on an entirely new dimension. Because while few people would question Boston's talent or importance to the Fever, seeing her ranked above the player who has become the face of the franchise instantly created another layer of intrigue. To understand why this became such a major talking point, you have to look beyond basketball ability. Aliyah Boston is one of the league's most respected young stars. She was a Rookie of the Year winner, a cornerstone player, and someone whose impact on both ends of the floor is impossible to ignore. Within basketball circles, her reputation is exceptionally strong. Coaches respect her, players respect her, analysts frequently praise her consistency and leadership. Nobody is suggesting that Boston doesn't deserve All-Star recognition. That isn't the issue. The issue is perception. For many casual fans, the Indiana Fever story over the last 2 years has largely revolved around Caitlin Clark. She has become the central figure in nearly every national discussion involving the franchise. So when supporters saw Boston sitting above Clark in the rankings, it felt like something they never expected to see. The reaction wasn't necessarily criticism of Boston. In fact, many Fever fans were quick to celebrate her success, while still expressing confusion about the overall rankings. What surprised people was the symbolism. Whether fair or unfair, Clark has become synonymous with the Fever's rise in national attention. She is the player appearing in headlines. She is the player driving television audiences. She is the player opposing arenas used to market upcoming games. Because of that, many fans naturally assumed she would lead not only her team, but the entire league in any popularity-driven vote. Seeing a teammate ranked ahead of her challenged that assumption in a dramatic way. Social media quickly turned the comparison into one of the most discussed aspects of the voting returns. Screenshots of the rankings spread everywhere. Fans debated whether the results reflected basketball respect versus fan popularity. Some argued that Boston's standing demonstrated how highly she is viewed by people inside the sport. Others saw it as evidence that the voting process was producing outcomes disconnected from public perception. Every discussion seemed to lead back to the same central question. If Caitlin Clark is the most visible player in the league, how does she end up trailing not only established superstars, but also someone who shares the same locker room? What made the situation even more fascinating was that it highlighted two very different forms of influence. Clark's influence is impossible to miss because it exists on such a massive public stage. Television ratings, sold-out arenas, social media engagement, and merchandise sales create visible evidence of her popularity. Boston's influence operates differently. Her impact is often reflected in the respect she commands within basketball circles, among coaches, players, analysts, and longtime observers of the league. Those two types of influence don't always produce the same results. One generates headlines, the other generates credibility. And for the first time, many fans began wondering whether the voting system might value one form of influence differently than the other. That's why the Boston-Clark comparison became about much more than two teammates competing for votes. It became a symbol of a larger conversation happening throughout the WNBA, a conversation about public popularity versus insider recognition, a conversation about whether the league's fastest-growing star receives the same level of support from people inside the game as she does from the fans filling arenas every night. And while nobody could point to a single definitive answer, the rankings seemed to suggest that those two worlds might not be perfectly aligned. The irony is that both players have been essential to Indiana's success. Clark and Boston have spent the last 2 seasons building chemistry, helping transform the Indiana Fever into one of the league's most relevant teams. Their partnership is frequently presented as the foundation of Indiana's future. Yet when the voting returns arrived, the rankings created the appearance of a competition that neither player was actually participating in. Suddenly, fans weren't discussing what Clark and Boston accomplished together. They were discussing why one stood ahead of the other.
And that comparison ultimately pushed people toward an even bigger realization. If Aliyah Boston could rank ahead of Caitlin Clark, despite Clark's overwhelming public visibility, then perhaps fan popularity alone wasn't driving these results. Perhaps something else was shaping the final order. Perhaps there were factors operating behind the scenes that most people didn't fully understand. And once fans started asking that question, they found themselves examining the mechanics of the voting process itself. Because the more they looked at the rankings, the harder it became to believe that simple popularity could explain everything. The deeper fans looked into the rankings, the more they discovered that the biggest surprise wasn't Caitlin Clark's position at all. The real surprise was how the vote is actually calculated. For years, many casual fans assumed All-Star voting worked the same way popularity contests usually work. The player with the most support from the public rises to the top. The player who attracts the most votes wins. Simple, straightforward, easy to understand. But when people started examining the WNBA's actual voting structure, they realized the process is far more complicated than most fans ever imagined. In fact, what many people thought was a fan vote is really only partially controlled by fans. At first glance, the league encourages participation as if the public has complete ownership of the outcome. Fans are told to vote, teams promote voting campaigns, social media accounts push daily reminders, broadcasters encourage viewers to cast ballots. Everything about the presentation gives the impression that the fans are deciding who starts the All-Star game. That's why so many people were shocked when they learned that fan voting only represents part of the equation. An important part, certainly, but not the entire story. In reality, the public controls only half of the final result. That single detail changes everything. 50% of the vote comes from fans. The remaining 50% comes from two groups that most supporters never think about when they submit their ballots. 25% comes from current players around the league. Another 25% comes from a designated media panel. Instead of one voting pool deciding the rankings, 3 separate groups each submit their own evaluations. Those evaluations are then combined to create the final order. Suddenly, the process isn't simply about who has the largest fan base. It's about how 3 very different groups view the same player. Once people understood that structure, Caitlin Clark's ranking started looking very different. Imagine for a moment that Clark dominates the fan vote. Given her popularity, that's hardly difficult to picture.
Her supporters are among the most active and passionate in the sport. They vote daily, they organize online campaigns, they flood social media with reminders and voting links. Everything about the presentation gives the impression that the fans are deciding who starts the All-Star game. That's why so many people were shocked when they learned that fan voting only represents part of the equation. An important part, certainly, but not the entire story. In reality, the public controls only half of the final result. That single detail changes everything. 50% of the vote comes from fans. The remaining 50% comes from two groups that most supporters never think about when they submit their ballots. 25% comes from current players around the league. Another 25% comes from a designated media panel. Instead of one voting pool deciding the rankings, 3 separate groups each submit their own evaluations. Those evaluations are then combined to create the final order. Suddenly, the process isn't simply about who has the largest fan base, it's about how 3 very different groups view the same player. Once people understood that structure, Caitlin Clark's rankings started looking very different. Imagine for a moment that Clark dominates the fan vote. Given her popularity, that's hardly difficult to picture. Her supporters are among the most active and passionate in the sport. They vote daily, they organize online campaigns, they flood social media with reminders and voting links. Everything about the presentation gives the impression that the fans are deciding who starts the All-Star game. That's why so many people were shocked when they learned that fan voting only represents part of the equation. An important part, certainly, but not the entire story. In reality, the public controls only half of the final result. What's fascinating is that each voting group naturally approaches the process from a different perspective. Fans often reward excitement, popularity, memorable moments, and emotional connection. Players may focus more heavily on on-court performance, competition, and respect earned between opponents. Media members might emphasize statistical production, narratives, team success, or season-long consistency. None of these approaches are inherently wrong, they're simply different. The challenge comes when those perspectives collide. A player who dominates one category may not dominate all 3. For Caitlin Clark, that distinction has become the center of the entire conversation. Her popularity among fans is not really up for debate, the evidence is everywhere. But the All-Star process isn't designed to measure popularity alone. It's designed to balance popularity with insider opinion. Whether someone views that as fair or unfair depends largely on what they believe an All-Star game should represent. Should it reflect the players fans most want to see? Should it reward the athletes most respected by their peers? Should it prioritize media evaluation? The current system attempts to do all 3.
And that may be the most important realization of all. The controversy surrounding Clark's ranking isn't necessarily the result of a broken process. It may simply be the result of a process doing exactly what it was designed to do. The fans provide one piece of the puzzle. Players provide another. The media provides the third. Once those pieces are assembled together, the final picture can look very different from the one any single group would create on its own. And for a player as uniquely popular as Caitlin Clark, that difference may be larger than anyone expected. To fully understand why Caitlin Clark's ranking has generated so much debate, you have to recognize something that makes her different from virtually every other player in the league. This isn't simply a story about an all-star vote. It's a story about what happens when a player becomes larger than the system designed to evaluate her. Most stars in professional sports follow a familiar path. They earn respect through years of success, gradually build a fan base, collect awards, and eventually become faces of their leagues. Clark's rise didn't follow that timeline. The moment she arrived, she brought an audience with her. Millions of people who had followed her college career didn't just watch her enter the WNBA, they followed her into it. Suddenly, a player wasn't merely joining the league, she was bringing new customers, new viewers, new attention, and new expectations all at once. That level of influence creates a unique situation. For many fans, Caitlin Clark isn't just one player among many. She is the reason they started watching in the first place. She is their entry point into the sport. That doesn't mean she's the best player in the league. It doesn't mean she's the most accomplished. It doesn't mean she's beyond criticism. What it does mean is that her relationship with fans is fundamentally different from the relationship most athletes have with their audience. When people buy tickets specifically to watch one player, when television networks promote her games as major events, and when social media conversations repeatedly revolve around her performances, that player occupies a different space than traditional stars. Clark's popularity isn't simply large, it's unusually concentrated. And with that popularity comes something equally important: polarization. Very few athletes generate a stronger reaction as Caitlin Clark does. Supporters view her as a transformational figure who has elevated the league's visibility to unprecedented heights. Critics argue that the attention surrounding her can sometimes overshadow other deserving stars. Others fall somewhere in the middle, acknowledging both her impact and the complicated conversations that have emerged around it. The result is a player who commands attention regardless of what side of the debate people stand on. Every great performance becomes a headline. Every rough game becomes a headline. Every controversy becomes a headline. Every accomplishment becomes a headline. In modern sports, attention is power, and nobody in the WNBA attracts more attention than Clark. That reality creates an interesting challenge within a voting system that combines fan opinion with insider opinion. Fans often respond to visibility. They respond to moments, narratives, excitement, and emotional investment. Clark excels in all of those areas. But players and media members may view the landscape differently. Their evaluations can be shaped by entirely different standards. They may focus more heavily on performance metrics, defensive impact, consistency, experience, team success, or other factors that don't necessarily align with public popularity. Again, that doesn't make either side right or wrong. It simply means they're looking through different lenses. This is why Clark represents such an unusual test case for the current voting system. Most players don't have a massive gap between their public profile and their insider profile. Most stars receive relatively similar levels of recognition across different voting groups. Clark's situation appears different because her public influence is so enormous. The larger that public influence becomes, the more noticeable any differences become between how fans view her and how other groups evaluate her. A player with a smaller profile might never expose those differences. Clark does, simply because the spotlight surrounding her is impossible to ignore. What's fascinating is that this debate extends beyond basketball itself. It touches on larger questions about what professional sports are becoming. Modern leagues rely heavily on star power. Television contracts depend on audience interest. Sponsors invest in recognizable faces. Social media rewards players who capture public attention. In many ways, popularity has become one of the most valuable assets an athlete can possess. Yet sports leagues also want credibility. They want competition to matter. They want excellence to be recognized beyond simple fame. The challenge is finding the balance between those two goals, and right now, Caitlin Clark sits directly in the middle of that balancing act. That's why her fifth-place ranking feels so different from any other player's ranking. If another star landed fifth, fans might discuss it briefly and move on. With Clark, the result immediately becomes a referendum on larger issues. It becomes a discussion about popularity versus recognition. It becomes a discussion about growth versus tradition. It becomes a discussion about whether the people bringing the largest audiences should also receive the greatest influence in fan-centered events. Those questions don't exist because Clark is fifth. They exist because Clark is Caitlin Clark.
And perhaps that's the most revealing part of this entire story. The debate surrounding her ranking isn't really about a single All-Star game. It's about the unique position she occupies within the sport. She is simultaneously one of the league's biggest assets, one of its most discussed figures, one of its most scrutinized players, and one of its most polarizing personalities. There simply isn't another athlete in the WNBA who combines all of those elements at the same scale, which means there isn't another athlete who exposes the strengths and weaknesses of the voting system quite the way she does. And once people began realizing that, the conversation started moving beyond rankings altogether and toward a much larger question about the future direction of the league itself. The reason this story refuses to disappear is because it has quietly evolved into something much bigger than All-Star voting. Beneath the rankings, beneath the arguments about percentages and voting formulas, there is another conversation taking place. A conversation about what the WNBA wants to be as it enters one of the most important periods in its history. Because whether people realize it or not, the reaction to Caitlin Clark's fifth-place ranking is exposing a tension that has been building inside the league for more than a year. It is a tension between explosive growth and traditional recognition, between attracting new audiences and preserving established hierarchies, between the fans who recently arrived and the people who have been here from the beginning. The reality is that the WNBA is not the same league it was just a few years ago. Television audiences have grown, national attention has increased, corporate partnerships have expanded. Games that once struggled for mainstream coverage now generate headlines across major sports networks. Much of that growth has come from a collection of talented stars throughout the league, but it would be impossible to discuss the recent explosion in visibility without mentioning Caitlin Clark. Her arrival brought unprecedented attention. Suddenly, people who had never watched a WNBA game before were tuning in. Casual sports fans who previously ignored the league were paying attention. New viewers were learning player names, following standings, and debating games. From a business perspective, that kind of growth is incredibly valuable. But rapid growth often creates uncomfortable questions. One of those questions is whether the league should fully embrace the player generating the largest audience or continue emphasizing a broader collection of stars. On the surface, that sounds like an easy decision. Most professional leagues aggressively market their most popular athletes. The NBA leaned heavily into Michael Jordan. The NFL built countless campaigns around Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes. The PGA Tour benefited enormously from Tiger Woods. Star power drives attention. Attention drives revenue. Revenue drives growth. Yet the situation surrounding Clark has often felt more complicated than those examples. Instead of complete agreement about her role, discussions around her impact frequently become debates. That's where much of the online speculation begins. Some fans believe Clark has not always received the level of promotion that a player with her influence would typically receive in other professional sports leagues. Others strongly disagree, arguing that she already receives more attention than almost anyone else in the WNBA. The truth likely depends on perspective. What matters is not which side is correct. What matters is the fact that the debate exists at all. When a player becomes the subject of constant discussions about media coverage, league priorities, and promotional strategies, it suggests something larger is happening beneath the surface.
There has also been growing discussion online about the relationship between Clark's popularity and how she is perceived within basketball circles. To be clear, much of this conversation remains speculation from fans rather than established fact. Rumors circulate constantly on social media. Some claim there is resentment toward the attention she receives. Others insist those narratives are exaggerated. Some believe her success has created divisions within the broader conversation around women's basketball, while others argue that such claims are overblown and unsupported. What can be said with certainty is that Clark's presence has sparked debates unlike anything the league has experienced before. And the intensity of those debates reflects just how transformative her arrival has been. What's fascinating is that both sides of the discussion often want the same thing. They want the WNBA to succeed. They want the league to continue growing. They want more viewers, bigger television deals, higher salaries, and greater national recognition. The disagreement centers on how that future should look. Should the league lean heavily into its most recognizable star? Should it focus on promoting a wider collection of established veterans and emerging talents? Can it successfully do both at the same time? These are difficult questions, and there are no simple answers. The All-Star voting controversy has unintentionally become a symbol of this broader identity debate. To many Clark supporters, her ranking feels like evidence that the league's most influential player is not being fully rewarded for the attention she generates. To others, the ranking reflects a system designed to recognize more than popularity alone. Neither interpretation exists in isolation. Both are connected to larger beliefs about what the league should prioritize moving forward. That's why a seemingly routine voting update has produced such a passionate response. People aren't just arguing about rankings, they're arguing about the future. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand. The WNBA's current challenge isn't a lack of talent. It's not a lack of attention. It's not a lack of momentum. The league has more visibility than ever before. The challenge is determining how to navigate a period of unprecedented growth while balancing the interests of longtime supporters, current players, league leadership, media voices, and an entirely new generation of fans. That's not an easy task for any sports organization, but it becomes even more complicated when one player sits at the center of almost every major conversation. Because whether people celebrate her rise or question the attention surrounding her, Caitlin Clark has become impossible to separate from the league's future. And the voting controversy has revealed just how divided opinions can become when popularity, recognition, and institutional decision-making collide. The irony is that this exact type of conflict isn't new. In fact, another major professional league faced a remarkably similar situation years ago, and the solution they created back then may explain exactly why the WNBA's voting system looks the way it does today.